The candles in Lady Holt's salon had been burning for 2 hours when the laughter began, and Georgiana heard every syllable of it across a room she had not been invited to enter. She stood near the door that connected the salon's outer passage to the main gathering, her back straight and her gloved hands folded at her waist, holding Mrs. Partridge's shawl and fan, and the small reticule that Mrs. Partridge had already forgotten she owned. 40 guests moved through the lamplit room beyond the half-open door, their silk and broadcloth catching the light in ways that Georgiana's plain dove-gray wool did not. She was not a servant. She was not a guest. She occupied the narrow, unnamed territory between those two states that London had assigned to companions since before she was born, and she had learned, over 2 years of service to Mrs. Partridge, to hold that territory with something approaching dignity. Lady Dorothea Vane was the one who ended that particular evening's attempt at dignity. The Countess of Pevering was a tall woman of perhaps 55, with a frame built for command and a voice that carried because she had never once in her life needed to raise it. She stood near the pianoforte with Miss Cecily Holt arranged beside her, like a carefully chosen ornament, and she was speaking at the precise volume required for her words to carry to the passage door, without appearing to intend them for anyone outside the room. "Who is that gray creature by the door?" she asked, addressing Miss Holt, but permitting the question to expand into the available air. "Mrs. Partridge's little companion? One forgets she is there until one nearly trips over her." A ripple of polite amusement moved through the guests nearest the pianoforte. Not cruel laughter, exactly. Social laughter, the kind that costs the laughers nothing, and lands on its object with the full accumulated weight of 40 people agreeing, in the space of a breath, that a woman was forgettable. Georgiana did not move. She adjusted her grip on Mrs. Partridge's shawl, smoothed a crease in the wool that did not exist, and kept her eyes on the middle distance. She was 23 years old, and she had heard variations of this particular observation for the better part of 2 London seasons. She had learned to receive it the way one receives cold rain, without flinching, without protest, and without the luxury of shelter. What she did not know, standing in that passage, was that a man had arrived at Lady Holt's house 12 minutes earlier, had been redirected to the salon by a footman, and had paused in the outer hall precisely long enough to hear Lady Vane's question and to observe the woman it was aimed at. She did not know what his face did in those 12 minutes. She would not learn it until much later in the season, in a different city of rooms entirely. The Pennington Ball arrived 3 days after the Salon, and Georgiana attended it in the same capacity she attended every public gathering during the season, as extension of Mrs. Partridge's anxious social ambition, positioned at the room's edge, near enough to be useful, and far enough from the chandelier's center of gravity to be ignored. The Pennington Ballroom held perhaps 120 guests on an ordinary night. Tonight it held more, because word had reached the better houses that Edmund Ashworth, the Duke of Ralston, had returned to London after 3 years of self-imposed absence from the season. Georgiana had heard this at breakfast, relayed by Mrs. Partridge with the flushed excitement of a woman who hoped proximity to a duke might improve her own daughter's prospects, though her daughters were not present, and the proximity itself was uncertain. Georgiana thought little of it. Dukes were part of the season's machinery, and she was not a moving piece in that machinery. She secured a glass of lemonade for Mrs. Partridge, located 2 acquaintances of Mrs. Partridge's near the east window, delivered her charge safely into their conversation, and retreated to the chair beside the second pillar, where she customarily spent the dancing hours. She had her book. She did not produce it, because producing a book at a ball was the kind of small rebellion that would cost Mrs. Partridge social capital, and Georgiana's position depended on Mrs. Partridge's comfort. She kept it in her reticule, and watched the room instead, cataloging the season's mechanics. Who spoke to whom? Who looked away first? Which debutante had been positioned near which eligible man by which arrangement of mothers? Edmund Ashworth arrived at 11 minutes past 9. She knew him because the room knew him. Not with applause or obvious turn of heads, but with a particular quality of attention, a collective intake of breath that a room full of well-bred people managed to perform without appearing to perform it. He was 31 years old, dark-haired, with a face built on the principle of restraint rather than expression. Not handsome in the easy way of the younger men near the supper room. Handsome in the way that things carved from difficult materials are handsome, because the difficulty is visible in the result. He spoke briefly to his host. He declined what appeared to be an introduction to a woman in pale blue silk, who was, Georgiana observed, positioned exactly as one positions someone they intend a man to notice. He moved through the room with the particular economy of a person who had learned that every step in a public space was being recorded. Then he crossed toward her pillar. Georgiana straightened her posture by a fraction, because her posture always corrected itself at threat, which was what her body had decided this was. He stopped 3 feet from her chair, and she saw, up close, that his eyes were a gray so dark they read as almost black in candlelight, and that he was looking at her directly, without the social fiction of looking slightly past. "Miss Hartley," he said. She blinked. No one at a ball had addressed her directly in 6 weeks of the season. "Your Grace," she said carefully, "I believe you may have mistaken me for someone else." "I have not." He offered his hand, the formal offer of it, the opening of a dance. "Will you do me the honor of the next set?" The pause that followed was the length of 1 heartbeat. Then 2. The room had not precisely stopped because rooms do not stop, but the quality of attention around the second pillar shifted the way attention shifts when a duke does something no one expected. Georgiana registered it peripherally. She registered, too, the distance across the room where Miss Holt stood with Lady Vane beside her, the Countess's fan arrested mid-motion. "I would," Georgiana said, "because what else does one say? And because her 23-year-old body had apparently decided for her before her mind caught up." She took his hand. He led her onto the floor, and they danced 1 full set together. And he said almost nothing. And she said almost nothing. And the room watched with the particular intensity of people witnessing something they will be describing at breakfast for the next several days. She kept her eyes on the middle distance, the way she had learned. He kept his eyes on her face. When the music ended, he returned her to her chair with the same formal precision with which he had collected her from it, inclined his head, and moved away into the crowd. Georgiana sat down. Her hands were steady. The rest of her was something she did not have a word for, something that her wound kept translating as a mistake, a social experiment, a duke amusing himself with the room's reaction. Mrs. Partridge appeared at her elbow within 2 minutes, radiating a particular quality of flustered pleasure. "My dear," she whispered, "every person in this room is staring." "I know," Georgiana said. "I am sorry if it caused you any inconvenience." Mrs. Partridge looked at her with an expression suggesting she had said something in a language that did not parse. "Inconvenience," she repeated, and then said nothing further, which was unusual. If you are finding yourself drawn into Georgiana's world, consider staying a little longer. What happens next is the part she did not see coming. The invitation to Ralston Park arrived the following Tuesday, addressed to Mrs. Partridge and her household, for a fortnight's visit in the country. The household, in this instance, meant Georgiana. Mrs. Partridge accepted with the speed of someone who had been hoping for exactly this, and did not want to permit the hoping to show. Ralston Park was 40 miles north of London, approached by a private road through elm trees that were old enough to have opinions. And the house at the end of that road was one of those great English houses that had been built in an age when the people who built things believed they would last. Stone the color of old honey. Gardens that had been formal once and had been allowed to soften at the edges without losing their underlying structure. A stable block with 6 horses visible in the yard, a walled kitchen garden, and somewhere behind the east wing, the sound of a child's voice that stopped abruptly when their carriage entered the courtyard. Georgiana noticed the stopping. The house's housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Crane, who had the particular brand of watchful competence that large establishments produce in their best servants, greeted them at the door and showed them to their rooms. Mrs. Partridge received a fine bedroom in the south-facing corridor. Georgiana received a smaller room in the same corridor, which was, she thought, more than she had expected and entirely comfortable, with a window that looked out over the kitchen garden and a writing desk that someone had recently polished. Edmund she did not see on the first day. She learned from Mrs. Crane, in the efficient shorthand that passes between a companion and a housekeeper who have both quickly assessed each other as people worth speaking plainly to, that his Grace was occupied with his steward through most mornings, that he took his meals with the household when guests were present, and that young Master Nate was, at present, finding the country somewhat difficult. "How long has he been difficult?" Georgiana asked, because the question interested her more than she expected. Mrs. Crane paused in the corridor, a set of household keys at her belt, and appeared to decide something. 3 years, she said, which was not an answer about the boy exactly, but an answer about the house. Since his mother died. He was 6 when it happened. Georgiana filed this away with the quiet precision she filed most things and went to unpack her single trunk. She encountered Nate Ashworth on the second morning in the kitchen garden at 8:30, when she had gone out alone with the intention of walking, and the boy had apparently had the same intention, and neither of them had expected the other. He was 9 years old, narrow-shouldered and dark-eyed like his guardian, with a face that was working hard at expressing nothing. He stood near the rosemary bed, with mud on one boot, and a look of someone who had been caught doing something he had not decided yet whether to be sorry for. "Good morning," Georgiana said. He said nothing. This was not rudeness, she thought. It was the same quality of silence she had learned to produce herself, in rooms where speaking risked too much. "I am Mrs. Partridge's companion," she said. "I am not here to make you do anything." He looked at her for a long moment. "Everyone is here to make me do something," he said. And it was the voice of a 9-year-old who had arrived at this conclusion by observation and found it reliable. "That is a reasonable assessment of most people," Georgiana said. "I will try to be the exception." He did not smile. He allowed her to continue her walk unmolested, which was, she thought, as much welcome as she had any right to expect. Over the following 3 days, she saw him 4 more times. They did not speak extensively on any occasion. She read in the library. He appeared at the door, saw her, and went away. She walked in the gardens. He walked at a parallel distance. She sat near the window seat in the long corridor after supper. He passed by twice, slowing almost imperceptibly on the second pass, and she did not look up from her book, because looking up would have ended the experiment. On the 4th day, a guest arrived from London. A Mr. Ferris, some connection of Mrs. Partridge's, with a loud voice and the particular social confidence of a man who had never once been uncertain of his welcome. He encountered Nate in the entrance hall and produced the kind of hearty attention to children that children find intolerable. "And here is the young lord," Ferris announced to no one in particular. "Quiet little creature, aren't you? Like a mouse. I had a dog once could root out mice in a wall in 3 minutes. He said this to Nate with the amiable assumption that Nate would find it amusing. Nate's face went very still. The quality of his stillness was something Georgiana recognized, and her body responded to it before her mind had fully formed the thought. "Mr. Ferris," she said from 2 steps up the staircase, at the precise volume that carried without appearing to project. "I believe Mrs. Partridge was asking for you in the drawing room. She has been waiting some time." Ferris looked up, surprised at being redirected, too socially uncertain of the source of the redirection to push back. He made a genial remark that meant nothing, and moved toward the drawing room. Georgiana came down the remaining 2 steps. She looked at Nate, who had not moved. "Rosemary or lavender?" she asked, because she had discovered in the past 4 days that questions about the garden were one of 3 subjects he would occasionally answer. "Rosemary," he said after a moment. "Good," she said. "I think so too." And they walked out to the kitchen garden. She did not know that Edmund had been crossing the gallery above the entrance hall when Ferris spoke, and had stopped at the balustrade. She did not know that he had watched the entire exchange from above, still as carved stone, with an expression on his face that was not the expression the season knew. She did not know that something had shifted in him at that moment, the way ice shifts over a river in late February, not breaking, not dramatic, but beginning, finally, to change its nature. She would learn this later. For now, she was in the kitchen garden with a 9-year-old who was, for the first time, walking beside her at the same pace. Dinner that evening was a formal affair. 9 at table, candles in silver, Mrs. Crane's considerable attention to menu visible in every course. Edmund sat at the head and directed the table's conversation with the economy of a man who had learned which questions produce useful answers and which produce social performance. He asked Georgiana once about her assessment of the current state of the lending library in the nearest village town, because she had mentioned it to Mrs. Partridge in passing, and the remark had apparently traveled. She answered honestly. She said the collection was strong in the preceding century and thin in the current one, that the librarian was diligent but underfunded, and that if someone with the means and the inclination were to provide a modest supplementary budget, it would not go to waste. Edmund looked at her across the table. She could not have named what his expression contained. "I will speak to my steward," he said. Mrs. Partridge looked between them with the pleased confusion of someone watching a piece of clockwork do something unexpected. After dinner, in the long drawing room, Georgiana found herself near the window, while Mrs. Partridge and Mr. Ferris engaged in the kind of conversation that fills drawing rooms and means nothing. Edmund crossed to the window. He stood beside her, looking out at the park in the early dark, and was silent for long enough that the silence became a kind of speech. "You did not have to intervene today," he said at last. "On Nate's behalf." "I know," she said. "He does not accept it easily from most people." "He accepted it from no one in particular," Georgiana said. "I simply removed the problem and then asked a question about herbs. The intervention, properly speaking, was invisible." A pause. Something in his face moved, very slightly, in the direction of something that might, in another man, have been the beginning of amusement. "That is a precise account of what happened," he said. "I try to be precise," she said. He looked at her then. Not the look that passes between guests at a dinner party. The other kind. The kind that takes account of a person. She held it for 2 seconds, and then turned back to the window, because her wound told her with great conviction that she was misreading him, that a duke's attention to a companion was a social courtesy, and nothing more, that she should not let herself locate warmth where there was only civility. She was wrong. She did not know it yet. 3 days later, in the library, he found her alone before the household was awake. She had not expected him. She was standing on the library's short ladder, returning a volume of natural history to the upper shelf, and she turned at the sound of the door and nearly lost her footing. And his hand came to the ladder's side rail at the same moment that her hand found it, and for 3 seconds they were 6 inches apart, with his fingers a fraction below hers on the same rail. She descended. He stepped back. The distance between them was restored to something a drawing room would sanction, and they both looked at the fire, which was the only other thing in the room to look at. "I owe you an explanation," he said, "about the ball, the Pennington ball." "You do not owe me anything, Your Grace." "I was at Lady Holt's house 3 days before the ball," he said. "I arrived late. I was redirected to the Salon." A pause in which the fire crackled and said nothing helpful. "I heard what Lady Vane said to you. I saw your face." Georgiana was very still. "You did not flinch," he said. "You stood there and received it, and then you smoothed a crease in a shawl that did not have one. And you looked at the middle distance, and you did not give her anything." She could not speak for a moment. The wound in her was very loud, telling her not to trust this, not to let it mean what it appeared to mean. "I asked you to dance because I had already seen what you were," he said, "and I wanted the room to see it too." The fire, the early light through the library's east-facing windows, the row of natural history volumes. She could name every object in the room, and she was having difficulty naming what was happening to her breathing. "That was kind," she said at last, which was not the truth exactly, but was the nearest thing she could manage. "It was not kindness," he said. "It was a statement of preference." He paused. "I am not, as a rule, good at making those." She looked at him. He looked at her. The gap between what each of them knew about the other and what each had been willing to say narrowed by a visible degree. That evening, Mrs. Crane found a moment to speak with Georgiana privately in the corridor outside the linen room. The housekeeper stood with her keys quiet at her belt and said, without ceremony, that she had served the House of Ralston for 22 years, that she had known His Grace since he was 8 years old, and that she had watched him grieve for 3 years over the carriage accident that had taken his first wife, the young Duchess Catherine, on a road to a dinner party that he himself had arranged, in a carriage he himself had chosen, in weather he himself had decided was manageable. "He has never forgiven himself," Mrs. Crane said, "and he has kept everyone at a distance since, everyone except the boy. And even with the boy, he does not know how to be what the boy needs." Georgiana received this. She thought about a 9-year-old who had been working very hard at expressing nothing for 3 years, and about a 31-year-old man who had been doing the same thing for the same amount of time. And she thought about how an entire house could be shaped by a single event that no one spoke of directly. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "I told you because you are paying attention," Mrs. Crane said, and went back to the linen room. The fortnight at Ralston Park was drawing toward its close when Lady Vane's mechanism arrived. It arrived, as mechanisms of its type generally do, not as a confrontation, but as a letter. The letter reached Mrs. Partridge on the 13th day of the visit, and its contents, which Georgiana learned about in fragments across a painful afternoon, constituted a report, sourced from persons unnamed, to the effect that Georgiana had been seen in circumstances that were not consistent with the conduct expected of a lady's companion, in proximity to His Grace of Ralston, in a context that suggested an intimacy that was professionally and socially inappropriate. The letter did not specify. It did not need to. Lady Vane had understood, in the 30 years of her experience in the season's machinery, that the specificity of an accusation is less powerful than its vagueness, because vagueness permits the reader's imagination to supply the worst version of events. Mrs. Partridge came to Georgiana's room that afternoon. She was a well-meaning woman, genuinely fond of Georgiana in the uncertain way of people who are fond of things they rely on and do not examine too closely. She sat on the edge of the small chair by the writing desk and held the letter in both hands and was visibly unhappy. "My dear," she said. "I understand," Georgiana said. "I cannot afford," Mrs. Partridge said, and then stopped, and then tried again. "Lady Vane has very considerable influence. If she were to withdraw from my circle and from the circles adjacent to mine, the damage to my daughters when they come out would be." "I understand," Georgiana said again, because she did. The machinery had a logic. It was not personal. Mrs. Partridge was not cruel. She was simply outranked by the forces pressing on her, and she had daughters to protect. "I will need you to leave the party," Mrs. Partridge said. "I will write you a strong character. I will ensure you have 3 months' wages." "I am very sorry." After Mrs. Partridge left, Georgiana sat at the writing desk for a long time. The kitchen garden was visible through the window. The rosemary bed, the lavender in the far corner, pale and exact in the afternoon light. She was 23 years old, dismissed from her 3rd position in 2 years, and the season's verdict was closing over her with the thoroughness of water closing over a stone. She could go quietly. She had enough money to reach her aunt's house in York. The season would end. Lady Vane's attention would move to another target. Eventually, with distance and time, the report's damage would fade to something she could work around. Or she could write the truth. She took out paper. She wrote a letter to Edmund, not asking him to intervene, not laying out a petition, not appealing to whatever charged and careful thing had been building between them across 2 weeks of a country house and 1 charged library morning. She wrote only what had happened, plainly, in the order it happened. She told him that Mrs. Partridge had received a letter from Lady Vane, that she was dismissed, that she did not believe the report had any foundation in fact, and that she was writing to him not because she expected rescue, but because he had told her he preferred precision. And this was her precise account of the situation. She sealed it. She gave it to the footman whose name she had learned was Thomas, because she had made it her practice across the fortnight to learn the names of every person in the house who did their work without recognition. And she had asked him once about his mother in the village, and he had told her at some length. And he was therefore a person who would, she thought, ensure the letter arrived. She packed her trunk. She came down the stairs at 5 in the morning. The house was quiet. Nate was at the end of the corridor in his nightgown, standing in the early light from the east window, and he looked at her with her trunk and her coat and her gloves, and he did not say anything, and she did not say anything. And she went out to the carriage that had been arranged. She did not see Edmund at all. His door was closed. She took the mail coach north toward York, and the season continued without her. She arrived at the Meredith Assembly through a series of events that were not, strictly speaking, her own decision. Her aunt in York had written to Mrs. Partridge 3 weeks after Georgiana's dismissal. Mrs. Partridge, whose guilt had apparently been working on her in the intervening period, had written back. A meeting had been suggested. The Meredith Assembly, a large formal gathering in the 4th week of June, was proposed as neutral ground. Georgiana had agreed because her aunt thought she should, and because she had not, in 3 weeks in York, been able to produce a convincing argument for anything being different than it was. The Meredith Assembly Room held approximately 100 guests and was, on the evening in question, very close to capacity. Georgiana arrived with her aunt, a composed woman named Mrs. Hale, who had the kind of reputation for good sense that insulates a woman from certain social attacks and provides cover for the people she accompanies. Mrs. Hale wore dark green silk. Georgiana wore the gray wool, which was the dress she had, and which was by now so well known to her body that wearing it was like wearing her own steadiness. Lady Vane was present. She stood at the room's center with Miss Holt beside her, and a cluster of acquaintances arranged around her like a statement of social authority. And when she saw Georgiana enter, something in her expression moved. Not alarm, calculation. She was deciding whether acknowledgement or continued dismissal served her better. Mrs. Partridge was present too, near the south windows, and she saw Georgiana, and her expression collapsed briefly into relief before reassembling itself into social performance. 2 women from the Holt Salon were present. A Mrs. Channing, who had been standing near the pianoforte on the night of Lady Vane's first public assessment, and a Miss Reeve, who had been at the supper table and had, Georgiana recalled, laughed. Both of them saw her now. Both of them looked away. Georgiana settled her aunt near the refreshment table and did what she had always done in rooms like this: located herself near the wall, smoothed a non-existent crease, looked at the middle distance. Lady Vane spoke, within 10 minutes, to a woman near Georgiana's left shoulder in the same carrying voice she had used at the Holt Salon. "Mrs. Partridge's gray creature," she said, still circulating, apparently. One would have thought the business at Ralston Park would have been sufficient instruction. 3 separate heads near Georgiana turned. The label landed, as it was designed to land, with the full weight of a public judgment delivered in a social setting where no polite contradiction was possible. Then the room changed. It changed the way rooms change when they register something that overrides their current arrangement. A shift of collective attention toward the entrance, a small audible recalibration of voices, the sound of skirts and coats adjusting as people turned. Edmund Ashworth walked into the Meredith Assembly Room at 9 minutes past 8. He was not supposed to be there. The Meredith Assembly was not the kind of event a duke of his standing customarily attended. He had not been announced. He had not, so far as anyone present could determine, been invited. He had simply arrived in full evening dress, with the particular quality of contained intention that his face wore when he had decided something. He stood at the entrance for 5 seconds and looked across the full length of the room. Georgiana watched him from near the wall, and her heart was doing something against her ribs that she did not have the vocabulary to describe. His gaze moved across the room. It found her. He crossed toward her. He crossed the entire length of the Meredith Assembly Room in front of approximately 100 people, who watched him do it with the complete silence of a crowd that understands they are witnessing something irreversible. He did not stop to speak to his host. He did not nod to acquaintances. He moved with the 3-stride economy of a man who had determined where he was going and regarded everything between him and his destination as simply distance to be covered. He stopped in front of Georgiana. "Miss Hartley," he said, which was his formal address, the one that carried the season's weight. "Your Grace," she said, which was all she had. "I received your letter," he said. He said it at a volume that the room could hear, which she understood was not an accident. "You wrote that you did not expect rescue." "I did not," she said. "You were correct," he said. "This is not rescue. This is a statement of fact." He turned then to face the room. Not theatrically. The way a man turns to address a room that he has decided it is time to address. "Lady Vane," he said. Lady Vane's fan was perfectly still. She looked at him with the calculation of someone revising their position in real time. "The report you transmitted to Mrs. Partridge regarding Miss Hartley was without foundation," he said. The room was very quiet. Miss Hartley conducted herself at Ralston Park with complete propriety, and with a quality of judgment and care that I found, and continue to find, to be beyond the ordinary. I would ask you to consider, publicly and at your earliest convenience, whether your account of her merits any revision." He was not loud. He did not need to be. Lady Vane's composure held for 3 more seconds. It was a testament to 30 years of practice that it held that long. Then something in her face shifted, the first public crack in a structure that had been maintained at considerable effort. And she said, in a voice that had lost its carrying quality entirely, "I see." Only 2 words, but what they contained was not calculation. It was something closer to recognition. "Mrs." Partridge moved forward from the south windows. Her movement surprised Georgiana, who had not expected it. Mrs. Partridge was not brave by nature. She was good by nature, which is different, and tonight the two had aligned. "I must add," Mrs. Partridge said, "to the room in general, and to no one in particular," which was exactly the right address for a public correction of a public error, "that I dismissed Miss Hartley on the basis of a report I should have examined more carefully. I was wrong to do so, and I am sorry for it." Her voice wobbled on the last sentence. She pressed on anyway. Georgiana looked at her. 23 years of managing her own visibility, of holding herself still in rooms that did not see her, of smoothing creases that did not exist, and she looked at Mrs. Partridge's wobbling courage and found, to her own considerable surprise, that her throat had tightened. Mrs. Channing, from the Holt Salon, had moved closer without appearing to move. Miss Reeve, from the supper table, was looking at her hands with an expression that was not comfortable. Neither of them laughed. Edmund turned back to Georgiana. "I also have something to say that is not a statement of fact," he said, which was, for a man who did not traffic in speeches, the most personal construction she had heard him produce. "Your Grace," she said carefully, "I have kept everything at a distance for 3 years," he said. It seemed, at the time, the appropriate response to loss. It was not. It was the convenient one. He was looking at her with the same look he had given her across the dinner table at Ralston Park, the one she had spent 3 weeks in York trying to explain away as civility. "You told me you tried to be precise. I will try to be equally precise. I would like you to come back to Ralston Park. Not as anyone's companion, as yourself, as the person I intend, with your consent, to have beside me for considerably longer than a fortnight." The room held its breath. "That is a very precise statement," Georgiana said at last. "I have had 3 weeks to compose it," he said. Something moved through her, starting at the base of her spine and arriving at the back of her eyes, the feeling of a verdict being overturned. Not dramatically, not loudly, but permanently, in front of the same witnesses who had delivered the original verdict. She looked at the room, briefly. Mrs. Channing. Miss Reeve. Lady Vane's stilled composure. Mrs. Partridge's relief. Her aunt's calm watchfulness from the refreshment table. 100 people who had heard the label fastened and who were now hearing it removed. "Yes," she said, simple and direct, and the most costly word she had spoken in years. "Yes, Your Grace, I will come back to Ralston Park." Miss Holt, standing at Lady Vane's side, had gone very quiet. She was a polished girl, well trained by the season's machinery, and she was not cruel, only positioned. She recognized, in the 4 seconds it took Edmund to offer his hand to Georgiana, that the machinery had moved in a direction that did not include her, and she accepted this with more grace than Lady Vane managed, her chin lifting slightly, her eyes going elsewhere, already revising her season's accounting. It was not victory for Georgiana over her, exactly. It was simply the machinery orienting itself along different lines, and Miss Holt was too much a product of that machinery to resist its new direction. He walked Georgiana into the next set. The floor was not the Pennington ballroom. The chandeliers were less dramatic, the assembly less grand. He led her through the figures as he had led her through them at the Pennington ball. with the same contained economy, the same quality of attention that was not the season's attention, that was something realer and more costly. "Nate asked after you," he said. During the figure that brought them briefly close, she looked at him. Did he speak, or did he simply look at the door? "He spoke," Edmund said. "He asked when you were coming back, and then appeared to find the question embarrassing, and went out to the kitchen garden." Her breath was not entirely steady. "The rosemary bed?" "Almost certainly." The dance ended. The season continued around them, its machinery still turning, its wheels still grinding, its verdicts still being issued and appealed and occasionally overturned. Lady Vane departed the Meredith Assembly early, which was itself a statement, and a quiet one, and the most any of the room's 100 witnesses were owed. Mrs. Partridge stayed until 11 and pressed Georgiana's hand at parting with real warmth. Mrs. Channing made her way across the room, eventually, and said something pleasant that meant not very much, but meant it genuinely. And Georgiana received it with the grace she had practiced her entire adult life, without having much occasion to exercise in circumstances this warm. She came back to Ralston Park in the second week of July. The elms along the private road were in full summer leaf. The kitchen garden was at its most productive and most fragrant. Mrs. Crane met her at the door with the particular expression of a woman who had, for 22 years, been waiting for the house to arrange itself correctly, and had been quietly unsurprised when it finally did. The months that followed were not the season. They were something the season had no category for. Two people learning, in the particular slow and honest way of people who had both been alone for a long time, what it was to be in the same room without armor. There were dinners and walks and mornings in the library and long evenings in the drawing room where the fire burned down and neither of them moved to end the conversation. There were careful negotiations about the future, conducted in the direct vocabulary of two people who had each decided that precision was more valuable than performance. There were moments of nearness that stopped just short of what they would eventually become, charged with an awareness that was entirely present and entirely chaste and entirely, quietly, unbearable in the best sense of the word. And there was Nate. Nate came to the kitchen garden more often. He began, by degrees, to remain in rooms that Georgiana occupied, rather than appearing at their doors and retreating. He read beside her in the library on 3 occasions. He asked her, one Tuesday morning in August, to help him identify a plant in the walled garden that he had been unable to name from the book of natural history she had returned to the upper shelf on her first morning at Ralston Park, and they spent the better part of an hour with the book open between them and the plant in question at their feet, and they identified it together, and he wrote its name in his notebook in the careful script of a 9-year-old who took the act of naming things seriously. He did not tell her he was glad she was back. He was 9, and it was not his way, and she did not need him to. Edmund asked her to marry him in the library in October, beside the fire, with the first autumn rain on the windows and the natural history book on the table between them, as an accidental witness. He was not eloquent, which was entirely consistent. He told her that he had spent 3 years believing that distance was the same as safety, and that she had made it impossible for him to continue believing this, and that he would like, if she was willing, to stop being at a distance from her for the foreseeable future. She told him yes, using the same words she had used at the Meredith Assembly, direct and simple, and she meant it with the same completeness she had meant it there, and more. The first snow came in November, earlier than usual, arriving overnight without announcement, the way the best things sometimes arrive. Georgiana stood at the window of the bedroom she now occupied in the south-facing corridor, not the small room with the view of the kitchen garden, though she was fond of that view, but the larger room that looked out over the park, over the elms that were bare now, their branches holding the new snow in clean lines against a sky the color of old pewter. The fire was lit behind her. The house was not yet awake. Nate appeared in the doorway. He had his nightgown on, and his feet were bare on the corridor floor, and he was 9 years old, and he had his father's expression of working hard at feeling nothing, except that this morning the expression was not quite holding, because the snow had done what snow does to children, which is to temporarily override the strategies they have learned for managing wonder. "It snowed," he said. "It did," Georgiana said. He crossed the room and stood beside her at the window and looked out at the park and the elms and the snow on the branches, and she could feel him beside her, his warmth, the particular quality of his small presence, and she did not put her arm around him because he had not yet offered that. She simply stood there with him and let the window hold them both. After a moment, he leaned, very slightly, against her side. She did not remark upon it. She looked out at the snow and the bare elms and the gray sky going slowly pale at the east, and she held very still, the way she had held still in every room that had dismissed her, except that this stillness was not the practiced stillness of self-protection. This was the stillness of someone who had been found. Edmund came to the doorway behind them, stopped there, and looked at the two of them at the window. His face did the thing it did now that it had not done 3 years ago or 6 months ago, the thing that was not quite amusement and not quite grief, and was something in between those two that had no name, but was clearly his. The particular expression of a man who has let something back in after a long time of keeping the door shut. The snow went on falling over Ralston Park. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the kitchen, Mrs. Crane was beginning the morning. The elms held their snow. Georgiana stood at the window with a 9-year-old leaning against her side, in a house that was hers now, and looked at the park that was hers now, and did not smooth any crease in anything, because there was nothing here that needed that particular kind of managing. If Georgiana's story stayed with you, leave a comment with the moment that meant the most. Every response is read, and your company in these stories matters.